Some houses carry their silence like a wound. The CO residence, for all its polished marble and floor-to-ceiling windows that drank the morning light and held it like a secret, had perfected a particular kind of quiet, the kind that wasn't peaceful, but waiting. Grace had learned to move through that quiet the way one learns to move through deep water, slowly, carefully, without disturbing the surface. By the time she told Junho So that he was building a cage for his daughter, she had already decided she was going to lose her job. She just didn't know yet if it would be worth it. She didn't know that 3 weeks later, a 7-year-old girl would call her in the middle of the evening and change everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start with the Tuesday morning that felt like any other Tuesday but wasn't. Grace woke at 5:30 to the sound of rain against the window of her small apartment in Gangnam. Not a hard rain, but the persistent, whispering kind that seeped into everything and made the city feel smaller than it was. She lay still for a moment, staring at the water-stained ceiling, her breath steady, her mind already moving through the rooms of a house that wasn't hers. She knew, without looking at a clock, that Yuna would be awake in exactly 40 minutes. The child had an internal rhythm that Grace had come to recognize like a musician recognizes a melody. Yuna stirred at 6:10, lay still for 7 minutes staring at the ceiling in exactly the way Grace did now, and then rose to wash her face with the small pink towel that hung on the right side of the bathroom rack. Never the left. Yuna was 7 years old, and already she had rituals, small anchors in a world that shifted too quickly beneath her feet. Grace dressed in the dark. Her uniform was simple: charcoal slacks, a cream-colored blouse, a cardigan the color of oatmeal that she had knitted herself during the long winter evenings when the CO house was asleep and she was too restless to join it. She didn't wear perfume, she didn't wear jewelry, except a thin silver bracelet, cool against her wrist, that had belonged to her mother. She was 34 years old, though she looked younger, and she had been working in the Seo household for 8 months. 8 months was long enough to learn the architecture of a family's sorrow. Long enough to know which floorboards creaked in the hallway outside Yuna's room. Long enough to know that Junho Se, when he came home from the office after a difficult day, always checked the mail on the console table twice, once with his eyes, once with his fingers, before he allowed himself to climb the stairs. The bus ride took 20 minutes. Grace sat by the window and watched Seoul wake up, the neon signs flickering off as the gray dawn asserted itself. A woman across the aisle was crying silently into a tissue, her mascara running in thin black rivers. Grace wanted to hand her a fresh tissue from her bag, but she didn't. She had learned, through years of domestic work, that some griefs needed privacy more than they needed comfort. She pressed her forehead against the cool glass and thought about Yuna's science project. The child had been collecting leaves for 3 weeks, pressing them between the pages of an old dictionary in the study, and yesterday she had shown Grace the result, a careful arrangement of ginkgo and maple, labeled in her neat, blocky handwriting. "Teacher said I could be a scientist," Yuna had whispered, not looking up, as if the words were fragile and might break if exposed to too much light. Grace had knelt down then, right there on the study carpet, and looked at the leaves as if they were the most precious things she had ever seen. "Your teacher is right," she had said. "You have the mind for it." The patience, the curiosity. Yuna had smiled then, a small, hesitant thing, like a door opening just a crack. The Seo house rose up from the street like a promise that hadn't quite been kept. It was modern, expensive, all angles and glass, the kind of house that announced its owner's success before he ever spoke a word. Grace punched in the code at the side gate. 4289, Yuna's birthday, a detail that Junho probably thought was secure, and let herself into the mudroom. She removed her shoes and placed them in the cabinet beside Yuna's tiny pink sneakers and Junho's polished leather loafers. The house smelled of cedar and lemon polish, a scent that Grace had come to associate with absence. It was the smell of a house that was cleaned too thoroughly, as if trying to erase something. She moved through the kitchen first, her fingers finding the light switch without looking. The refrigerator hummed. She took out the milk, poured exactly 200 milliliters into a small saucepan, and set it on the stove over the lowest flame. Warm, not hot. Yuna would drink it in 7 minutes, and if it were too hot, she would wait for it to cool, her small hands wrapped around the cup, her eyes distant. Grace had learned this. She had learned that Yuna took her milk at precisely 60 degrees Celsius, that she liked the crusts cut off her toast but not removed entirely, just pushed to the side of the plate where she could see them, where they didn't feel like waste. She had learned that Yuna hummed when she was concentrating, a tuneless little melody that made Grace's chest ache with something she couldn't name. At 6:10, Grace heard the small sound of feet on the stairs. Not running, Yuna never ran in the mornings. She appeared in the kitchen doorway in her blue pajamas, her black hair tangled on one side, her eyes puffy with sleep. She didn't say good morning, she just looked at Grace, and Grace looked back, and something passed between them that needed no translation. "Warm milk," Grace said, setting the cup on the table, "and toast. The strawberry jam you like." Yuna climbed onto the chair. Her legs were too short to reach the floor, and they swung slightly, the heels of her feet bumping against the wood in a rhythm that matched the rain outside. She picked up the toast and took a small bite. Then she looked up at Grace, her dark eyes enormous in her small face. "Grace," she said, "can I ask you something?" "Anything. Do you think Appa will be home for dinner tonight?" Grace felt the familiar tightening in her chest. She kept her face still. "I don't know, Yuna. Your father is very busy." "Last time he was home," Yuna said, picking at the crust on her plate, "he didn't eat. He just looked at his phone, and then he said my piano playing was too loud." Grace said nothing. She turned to the sink and began washing a bowl that was already clean, just to have something to do with her hands. "I can practice quieter," Yuna continued. "If he comes home, I can play the soft pedal the whole time." "Yuna," Grace said, and her voice was softer than she intended. "You don't have to make yourself small for anyone, not even for Appa." Yuna looked at her then, really looked at her, and Grace saw something flash across the child's face. Recognition, or hope, or fear. It was gone before she could name it. Yuna drank her milk. Outside, the rain began to fall harder. If you're listening to this and you've ever made yourself smaller to keep someone else comfortable, I want you to pause for a second and breathe. I want you to remember the last time you swallowed a word that wanted to be spoken. Drop a comment below and tell me what that word was. Or just write, "I hear you," if you're not ready to say it yet. And if this story is already sitting heavy in your chest, hit the like button. It helps more than you know. Junho So left the house at 7:15, as he did every morning. Grace heard his footsteps on the stairs, heavy, deliberate, the gait of a man who was always walking toward something urgent. He appeared in the kitchen doorway in his navy suit, his tie perfectly knotted, his hair still damp from the shower. He was 41 years old, handsome in the severe way of men who have never allowed themselves to be soft, and he carried with him the particular exhaustion of someone who had built an empire from nothing and couldn't stop to enjoy it. He looked at Yuna, who had straightened in her chair at the sound of his approach. "Appa," Yuna said, her voice bright and careful at the same time, like a candle in a draft. "Study hard today," Junho said. He did not kiss her forehead. He did not ruffle her hair. He looked at his watch, then at Grace, and nodded once, a gesture that was less greeting and more acknowledgement of her function. "There is a meeting tonight. I will be late." "Shall I leave dinner in the warmer?" Grace asked. "Don't bother." He picked up his briefcase from the counter. "I'll eat at the office." He left through the front door, and the house seemed to exhale. Yuna's shoulders dropped. She looked down at her toast, now cold, and pushed the plate away. "He's always at the office," she said quietly. "Your father works very hard," Grace said, the words, automatic, worn smooth by repetition. "For what?" The question hung in the kitchen air like smoke. Grace turned to look at the child. Yuna was staring out the window at the rain, her chin resting on her small hands, her expression unreadable. "So you can have everything you need," Grace said, but the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "I don't need everything," Yuna said. "I need him to look at me when I talk." Grace felt her throat close. She walked over to the table and knelt beside Yuna's chair. She didn't touch her. She knew better than to touch without invitation. But she stayed there, at eye level, until Yuna turned to look at her. "Tell me about the clock radio," Grace said. Yuna's face changed. It was like watching a light switch on behind fog. "It's in the storage closet, the one with the broken antenna. I found it last week when I was looking for my old coloring books." And you want to fix it? I think I can. I watched a video about circuits and soldering. Yuna's voice sped up, losing its careful cadence. The problem is the capacitor, probably, or the transformer. I need to open it up and see. Grace smiled. You know what a capacitor is? Stores energy. Like a tiny battery. Yuna's eyes were shining now. Grace, can I show you? After school, can we look at it together? Of course we can. Yuna threw her arms around Grace's neck, then, sudden and fierce, her small body trembling with the force of her own enthusiasm. Grace held her, feeling the child's heartbeat against her collarbone, rapid and wild as a bird's. She smelled like milk and sleep and something uniquely Yuna, something that Grace knew. With a certainty that frightened her, she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The school bus came at 8. Grace walked Yuna to the gate, holding an umbrella over both of them, though the rain had softened to a drizzle. Yuna's backpack was too big for her, pulling her shoulders back, and she carried her lunchbox in both hands as if it were precious cargo. Engineers need good lunches, Yuna had declared the night before, when Grace had asked if she wanted the cafeteria food instead. For brain energy. Brain energy, Grace had repeated, packing rice and bulgogi and small pickled vegetables into the box. Absolutely. At the bus stop, Yuna turned and looked back. Grace stood in the rain, her cardigan darkening with wetness, and waved. Yuna didn't wave back. She just looked at Grace for a long moment, her face serious and old beyond its years, and then climbed onto the bus. Grace walked back to the house. She spent the morning in the rhythms of maintenance, folding laundry so precisely that the edges aligned like architecture, polishing the glass tables until they disappeared, vacuuming the rugs in straight lines that spoke of order. She was good at this. She had been good at it for 15 years, since she had left her hometown at 19 and come to Seoul with nothing but a borrowed suitcase and a determination not to return. She had worked in 5 houses before this one. She had learned to be invisible, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to leave a room more peaceful than she found it. But she had never learned how to stop caring. That was her flaw, if you could call it that. She cared about the families she served. She remembered their birthdays, their allergies, their fears. She knew that Junho So took his coffee black except on Mondays, when he added a single sugar cube because Monday was the anniversary of his father's death and he couldn't bear the bitterness. She knew that Yuna slept with a nightlight not because she was afraid of the dark, but because the dark made her feel alone in a house that was too big for 3 people. At noon, she took her lunch on the small balcony off the kitchen. The city spread below her, a tapestry of gray and chrome and sudden flashes of color. Red umbrellas, yellow taxis, the green of a distant park. She ate kimchi and rice and thought about the screwdriver set she had bought last week. She had seen it in a hardware store window, a delicate set of precision tools in a velvet case, and she had thought immediately of Yuna's small fingers, their surprising dexterity. She had left it on Yuna's desk yesterday afternoon while the child was at piano lessons. No note, no explanation. Just the tools, waiting like an invitation. Grace didn't know if Yuna had found them yet. She hoped so. She hoped the child understood what she was trying to say. I see you. I see what you love, and it matters. The afternoon passed in the slow golden light of a clearing sky. Grace changed the sheets in the master bedroom, smoothing the duvet until it looked like untouched snow. She stood for a moment in the center of the room, looking at the photograph on the dresser. Junho and Yuna, taken 2 years ago at a beach. Yuna was 4, laughing, her feet buried in sand. Junho was smiling, a real smile that reached his eyes, his arm around his daughter with a protectiveness that made Grace's chest tighten. She didn't know what had happened between that beach and this house. She didn't know where Yuna's mother was. The subject was never spoken of, and Grace had learned not to ask. But she knew that the man in the photograph and the man who had left that morning were not the same person. Something had hardened in him. Something had turned his love into a weight instead of a wing. She was dusting the study when she heard the front door open. It was 4:30, too early for Junho, too late for Yuna's bus. Grace stepped into the hallway, duster in hand, and saw Junho standing in the foyer, his briefcase on the floor, his tie loosened. He looked up at her, and his face was strange, drawn, almost vulnerable. The mask of the businessman slipped askew. Mr. CO, Grace said. Is everything all right? The meeting was canceled, he said. His voice was rough. Yuna? Not home yet. The bus comes at 5. He nodded. He stood there, a tall man in an expensive suit, looking lost in his own house. Grace watched him, saying nothing. She had learned that silence was sometimes the only gift she could give. Grace, he said, and stopped. He ran a hand through his hair. Never mind, I'll be in my study. Shall I bring tea? No. He disappeared into the study and closed the door. Grace stood in the hallway, listening to the sound of her own breathing. She finished dusting. She prepared a snack for Yuna, rice cakes and fruit, arranged on the blue plate that Yuna preferred. At 5, she heard the bus brake at the corner, and she went to the gate with an umbrella, though the rain had stopped. Yuna ran to her, actually ran, her backpack bouncing, her face flushed with excitement. Grace, Grace, I found them! Grace knelt, holding the umbrella over both of them. Found what? The tools! The screwdrivers! They were on my desk when I came home yesterday. Yuna's voice was breathless, her eyes enormous. Are they from you? Are they? Grace touched Yuna's cheek, brushing away a streak of dirt. Do you like them? I love them. Yuna's voice cracked slightly, and Grace realized the child was close to tears. Grace, no one has ever given me something for my fixing. Usually they say, stop touching, don't break it, be careful. But you, she threw her arms around Grace again, and Grace held her in the middle of the sidewalk, in front of the glass house, in front of the whole watching world, and felt something inside her shift and settle. Show me what you want to fix first, Grace said into Yuna's hair. The clock radio, tonight, after homework. Promise? Promise. They walked back to the house hand in hand. Yuna talked the entire way, her words tumbling over each other like water over stones. About the capacitor, about the transformer, about how she had read that engineers needed to understand electricity, and how she had drawn a circuit diagram in her notebook during math class, because she already knew the multiplication tables and the teacher hadn't noticed. Grace listened to every word, storing them like treasures. She didn't see Junho standing in the study window, watching them. She didn't see the way his hand pressed against the glass, or the expression on his face that might have been longing, or might have been something else entirely. Saturday arrived with a sky so clear it seemed washed clean. Grace woke early, as always, but the house felt different. Lighter. Junho had not gone to the office. He was in the kitchen when Grace came downstairs, reading a newspaper, a cup of coffee steaming beside him. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment his expression was unreadable. Grace, he said, Saturday, you didn't need to come in. I always come in Saturdays, Mr. Seo. Yuna has piano in the morning and then... Yes, of course. He folded the newspaper. I forgot. He was lying. Grace knew he was lying. Junho Seo did not forget anything. He remembered stock prices from 3 years ago, the names of junior associates' wives, the exact date of every quarterly report. He had not forgotten that Grace worked Saturdays. He had simply not expected to be home to see it. Will you be staying in today? Grace asked, moving to the refrigerator. I have some calls to make, then perhaps, he paused, perhaps I will spend some time with Yuna. Grace felt a small flutter of hope. She didn't let it show. She would like that. She has been talking about you, Junho said, his voice neutral, about the things you teach her. Grace's hand paused on the milk carton. I haven't taught her much, Mr. Seo, just how to look at things carefully, how to be patient. Patience? Junho repeated, as if tasting the word. Yes, she needs that. He stood up. I will take my calls in the study. Send her in when she wakes. She's already awake. She's in her room. Reading. Junho looked surprised. So early? She woke at 6. She wanted to get her homework done before... Grace stopped. Before what? Before the clock radio, Grace said quietly. She wants to fix it today. She asked me to help her. Junho's face changed. A shadow passed across it, there and gone. That old thing? In the storage closet? Yes. Why would she want to fix that? Because it's broken, Grace said, and the simplicity of the answer seemed to hang in the air between them. And because she thinks she can. Junho looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and went to his study. Grace watched him go, wondering what she had seen in his eyes. It looked almost like fear. Yuna came downstairs at 7, dressed in her Saturday clothes, soft leggings and a sweater the color of buttercups. She ate her breakfast quickly, her leg bouncing under the table, her eyes darting toward the hallway that led to the storage closet. "Slow down," Grace said, though she was smiling. "The clock radio isn't going anywhere." "But Appa is home," Yuna whispered, leaning across the table. "What if he wants to do something? What if he wants to go out?" "Then you'll go out," Grace said, "and you'll fix the clock tonight." "But what if he changes his mind about being home? What if he leaves?" Grace reached across the table and steadied Yuna's bouncing leg with a gentle hand. "Then you'll fix it with me, just like we planned, no matter what." Yuna studied her face, searching for something. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her. She finished her toast, drank her milk, and then, miracle of miracles, Junho emerged from his study. "Yuna, he said. "How is my daughter this morning?" Yuna froze. Her fork clattered against her plate. "Appa? Come here, let me look at you." Yuna slid off her chair and walked to her father with the careful steps of someone approaching a wild animal. Junho knelt, an awkward movement, his suit jacket pulling tight across his shoulders, and looked at his daughter. He didn't touch her, he just looked, as if trying to memorize her face. "You've grown," he said. 2 centimeters, Yuna whispered. Grace measured. "Grace measures everything," Junho said, and there was something in his tone that Grace couldn't read. Not quite criticism, not quite gratitude. "What would you like to do today?" Yuna's mouth opened, closed, opened again. I have homework and piano, and then I wanted to..." "Yes? Fix something," with Grace. Junho's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, but Grace saw it. She saw the way his shoulders drew back, the way his hands found his pockets, the way he retreated behind his own face. "Of course," he said. "Your science. Projects. Very well. Piano first. Then you may do your fixing." He stood up. He didn't look at Grace. He walked to the living room and sat in the armchair by the window, opening his laptop, becoming immediately absorbed in the glow of the screen. Yuna looked at Grace, her eyes wide and confused. "It's okay," Grace mouthed. "Go practice." Yuna went to the piano. The scales began, soft and hesitant at first, then gaining confidence. Junho didn't look up from his laptop. Grace stood in the kitchen and listened to the music and felt something cold settle in her stomach. If you're a parent listening to this, I want you to think about the last time you really looked at your child. Not at their grades, not at their behavior, not at whether they were making you proud or giving you trouble. Just looked at them, the way you look at a sunrise, with no expectation except wonder. If you can't remember, that's not a condemnation, it's an invitation. Keep listening. The morning passed. Yuna practiced piano for an hour, her small fingers finding the keys with increasing certainty. Junho worked on his laptop, his face illuminated by the blue light, his expression distant. Grace moved through the house, cleaning things that were already clean, her ears tuned to the frequencies of the household, the creak of Junho's chair, the pause between Yuna's scales, the hum of the refrigerator. At 11, she brought Yuna a glass of water and a small plate of sliced apples. "You're playing beautifully," she said. "Appa didn't look up once," Yuna said, not looking up from the keys. "He's working. He's always working." Yuna took a sip of water. Her hands were trembling slightly. "Grace, do you think he'll let me fix the clock?" "Really?" I think he said yes. But his voice was... "I know," Grace said. "But sometimes people say things in strange voices because they're afraid, not because they mean no. Do you understand?" Yuna shook her head. "Sometimes," Grace said carefully, "when grown-ups see their children becoming something they don't understand, they get scared. They think they need to protect you from failing, or from being different, and they say things that sound like no, but they're really just confusion." "Appa isn't confused," Yuna said. "He knows exactly what he wants." "Does he?" Yuna looked up at her, and Grace saw the child weighing this, turning it over in her mind like one of her broken mechanisms. "I don't know," Yuna finally said. "I don't know what he wants. I don't know what I want either, except to fix things, to make them work again." Yuna's voice dropped to a whisper. Is that bad? Grace felt her heart crack open. No, baby. That's the best thing. That's the very best thing. At noon, Jun-ho closed his laptop. He stood up and stretched, a man unused to stillness. Lunch, he announced. Yuna, come. We'll go to the restaurant on the corner. The one with the noodles you like. Yuna's face lit up. Really? Really? Go get your shoes. Yuna ran from the room, her feet pounding up the stairs with a joy that made Grace's eyes sting. Jun-ho turned to her. He was standing in the center of the living room, his hands in his pockets, and he looked almost young, almost uncertain. Grace, he said, thank you for what you do for her. Grace felt the words like a stone. I don't do anything special, Mr. Seo. I'm here. Yes, Jun-ho said. You are. That is special. He looked toward the stairs, where Yuna's footsteps were echoing. I don't know how to be what she needs. I build companies. I negotiate contracts. I understand balance sheets. But she... He stopped. She wants to fix clock radios. I don't know what that means. It means she's curious, Grace said. It means she's brave. It means she sees something broken, and instead of turning away, she asks how to make it whole. And you think that's good? I think it's everything, Grace said. Jun-ho looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something shift in his eyes. A crack in the armor. A door opening, just a fraction. Perhaps, he said, you could join us for lunch. If you're not busy. Grace was rarely not busy. There was always something to clean, something to prepare, something to anticipate. But she looked at this man, this powerful man who was asking her to lunch with the awkwardness of a boy asking a girl to dance, and she felt a strange tenderness rise in her. Thank you, she said. I'd like that. The restaurant was small and warm, filled with the steam of boiling broth and the murmur of Saturday conversations. Yuna sat between them, her face flushed with pleasure, her eyes darting from her father to Grace and back again. She ordered the noodle soup, and Jun-ho ordered the same, and Grace ordered a simple rice dish that she knew she wouldn't finish because her stomach was tight with something she couldn't name. Appa, Yuna said, slurping a noodle, did you know that electricity travels at almost the speed of light? Is that so? Jun-ho said, and his voice was different here, softer, almost playful. And did you know that if you connect a capacitor wrong, it can explode? Not a big explosion, just a pop, but still. That sounds dangerous. Only if you're not careful. Grace says being careful is the most important part of fixing things. Jun-ho looked at Grace. Does she? Being careful, Grace said, and being patient, and not being afraid to look at something broken and believe it can be whole again. Jun-ho was quiet for a moment. He stirred his soup. Yuna, he said. When I was your age, my father told me that a man's worth is in what he builds, not in what he fixes, in what he creates from nothing. Yuna's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. What did you build, Appa? Companies, Jun-ho said. A life. A future. Did you like it? The question was so simple, so direct, that Jun-ho seemed struck by it. He opened his mouth, closed it. It was necessary. It was what I had to do. But did you like it? Grace watched Jun-ho's face. She saw the war there, the battle between the man he had been told to be and the man he might have been. I liked the feeling, he said slowly, of making something exist that didn't exist before, of being necessary. Yuna nodded, absorbing this. That's what fixing is too. Making something exist again, being necessary to it. Jun-ho looked at his daughter as if seeing her for the first time. Grace held her breath. For a moment, just a moment, the three of them sat in a perfect bubble of understanding, and Grace allowed herself to hope. Then Jun-ho's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, and the mask slid back into place. Excuse me, he said. I need to take this. He stood up and walked to the front of the restaurant, his phone pressed to his ear, his shoulders tense. Yuna watched him go, and the light in her face dimmed. He's leaving again, she said. He's just taking a call, Grace said. He's always just taking a call. Yuna pushed her bowl away. Can we go home now? I want to fix the clock. They went home. Junho stayed at the restaurant, his call stretching into the afternoon, and Grace and Yuna walked back to the house in the bright cold of the Saturday afternoon. Yuna was quiet, her hand in Grace's, her eyes on the sidewalk. "Grace," she said as they turned onto their street. "Yes? Do you think Appa will ever see me? Really see me?" Grace squeezed her hand. "I think he wants to. I think he's trying. But trying isn't the same as doing." "No," Grace said. "It's not." Back in the house, Yuna went straight to the storage closet and emerged with the clock radio. It was an old thing, beige plastic with a cracked display, the antenna bent at a sad angle. She carried it to the living room floor and sat cross-legged, spreading a towel beneath it to protect the carpet. She opened the small velvet case of screwdrivers and selected the Phillips head, her tongue between her teeth in concentration. Grace sat on the sofa nearby, darning a sock that didn't need darning, just to be present. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, turning the dust motes into gold. Yuna unscrewed the back panel, her movements precise and careful, and peered inside at the tangle of wires and circuits. "See?" she said, pointing. "The capacitor. It's bulging. That means it's dead." "How do you know?" "Grace, I told you. I watched videos." Yuna's voice was muffled, her head bent close to the mechanism. "And I read a book. From the library. About electronics." Grace smiled. "You're remarkable." "I know," Yuna said without arrogance. "It was a statement of fact, like saying the sky was blue. I just need to figure out where to get a new capacitor. Maybe online. Or maybe..." She looked up, her face smudged with dust. "Maybe Appa will take me to an electronics store. If I ask nicely. If I don't bother him too much." "Yuna," Grace said, "you don't bother him. You're his daughter. Then why does he look at me like I'm a problem?" The question hit Grace like a physical blow. She set down her darning. "He doesn't look at you like..." "He does," Yuna said quietly. "When I talk about science, when I talk about fixing things, he looks at me the way he looks at a contract he doesn't want to sign, like I'm something he has to deal with." She turned back to the clock, her small fingers tracing the wires. "I don't want to be dealt with. I want to be, I don't know, celebrated? Is that the word?" "Yes," Grace whispered. "That's the word." They worked in silence for a while. Yuna removed the dead capacitor and set it aside like a surgeon removing an organ. She made notes in a small notebook. Diagrams, labels, questions. Grace watched her, this small, serious person with her future written in her careful hands, and felt a fierce protectiveness rise in her like a tide. At 2:00, the front door opened. Junho came in, his coat smelling of cold air and cigarette smoke. He stopped in the foyer and looked toward the living room. Yuna didn't look up. She was deep in her work, her brow furrowed, her hands steady. "Yuna, Junho said. "What are you doing?" "Fixing the clock," Yuna said, not pausing. "The capacitor is dead. I need to replace it." Junho walked into the living room. He stood over his daughter, looking down at the disassembled radio, the scattered tools, the towel on his expensive carpet. Grace watched from the sofa, her body tense. "Where did you get those tools?" Junho asked. "Grace gave them to me," Yuna said. She selected a wire cutter and began trimming a damaged lead. "Aren't they perfect? They're exactly the right size." Junho looked at Grace. His expression was unreadable. "Grace," he said, a word. "In a moment, Mr. Seo. Yuna is... now." Grace set down her darning and stood. She followed Junho into the kitchen. He turned to face her, his face hard. "You bought her tools?" "Yes." "Without asking me?" "She needed them," Grace said. "For her projects, for her learning. She is 7 years old. She doesn't need to be learning this." He gestured vaguely toward the living room. "She needs to focus on her schoolwork, her piano, her appropriate activities." Grace felt something cold and hard form in her chest. "Appropriate," she repeated. "Don't look at me like that. You know what I mean. Girls her age should be what, Mr. Seo?" He faltered. "Dancing, drawing, playing with dolls, not soldering wires." She likes soldering wires, Grace said. She's good at it. She's good at understanding how things work. Why is that less appropriate than dancing? Because Junho stopped. He ran his hand through his hair. Because the world is not kind to women who choose difficult paths. Because I don't want her to struggle. Because I want her to have a life that is smooth, comfortable, not full of broken clock radios and disappointment. And if she wants more than smooth? Grace asked. If she wants meaningful? If she wants to build and fix and understand? She's 7, Junho said, his voice rising. She doesn't know what she wants. She needs guidance. She needs to be steered toward things that will serve her, not indulged in every whim. This is not a whim, Grace said, and her voice was steady, though her hands were shaking. This is who she is, and if you steer her away from who she is, Mr. CO, you won't get a smooth daughter. You'll get a broken one. Junho's face went white. How dare you, he said softly. How dare you speak to me about my daughter? You are an employee, a housekeeper. You clean my floors and cook my meals, and you do not presume to tell me how to raise my child. Grace felt the words like slaps. She stood very still. You're right, she said. I am an employee, but I am also the person who is here when you are not. I am the person who sees her face when she comes home from school. I am the person who hears her dreams. And I am telling you, Mr. CO, that if you take this from her, if you tell her that her mind is too small for her dreams, you will lose her. Not today, not tomorrow, but slowly, piece by piece, until she is a stranger who happens to live in your house. Junho stared at her. His chest was heaving. For a moment, Grace saw something flash in his eyes, doubt or pain or regret. Then his jaw tightened and he stepped back. Go back to work, he said, and stay away from my daughter's education. Grace returned to the living room. Yuna was still working, oblivious, her small hands busy with wires. Grace sat on the sofa and picked up her darning, but she couldn't see the stitches. Her eyes were blurred with tears she refused to let fall. Before we go further, I need to ask you something. Think about the adult you needed when you were young. The one who would have stood between you and the world and said, not this child, not today. If you had that person, thank them in the comments. If you didn't, write, I needed a Grace. I want to see those words. I want you to know you're seen. And if this story is making you feel something, subscribe. Not for me, for the part of you that needed this story. The afternoon light shifted and mellowed. Yuna worked on her clock, and Grace sat with her, and Junho retreated to his study, and the house held its breath. At 4, Yuna sat back on her heels and announced, I need a new capacitor. I can't finish without it. We'll order one, Grace said. It will come Monday. Monday, Yuna repeated. That's forever. Monday is 2 days, Grace said, smiling. You can wait 2 days. Can I keep the tools at my desk? Of course. Yuna packed the screwdrivers carefully into their velvet case. She placed the clock radio back in its box, the back panel loose, the wires exposed like a patient waiting for surgery. She cleaned up the towel, put away the notebook, and stood up. Grace, she said. Yes? Thank you. For the tools. For believing me. Grace knelt and pulled Yuna into her arms. She held her tight, breathing in the smell of her hair, feeling the small, sturdy bones of her back. Always, she whispered. I will always believe you. Yuna pulled back and looked at her. Promise? Promise. They didn't know Junho was watching from the hallway. They didn't see the way his hand gripped the doorframe, or the way his face crumpled for just a second before smoothing into stone. They didn't hear him climb the stairs and stand outside Yuna's door for 10 minutes, his hand raised to knock, before he turned and went to his own room and lay on his bed in the dark, staring at the ceiling. That evening, Grace prepared dinner, though no one had asked. She made Yuna's favorite, soft tofu stew, rice, the small side dishes that Yuna loved but never requested because she was too polite. Junho came down at 7, his face composed, his armor back in place. They ate in silence, the 3 of them, the clink of spoons against bowls the only conversation. Appa, Yuna said, when the meal was almost done. My teacher says I'm very good at science. She says maybe I could be an engineer one day. Junho didn't look up from his bowl. An engineer, he said. His voice was flat, distant, the voice of a man who had already decided the conversation was over. Yes, like Grace says, I have the mind for it, the patience, Yuna. Junho set down his spoon. It rang against the ceramic, sharp and final. Be practical. That is not a path for girls. You'll find something more suitable when you're older. The words fell into the room like stones into still water. Yuna went very still. Her face went blank, the way a child's face goes blank when the pain is too large to express. She looked at her father, then at Grace, then back at her bowl. She didn't cry. She had learned not to cry. Crying made things worse. Crying made adults uncomfortable. Yes, Appa, she said quietly. Junho stood up. He didn't look at either of them. I have work to do. Good night. He left. Yuna sat at the table, her hands in her lap, her eyes fixed on the empty space where her father had been. Grace sat across from her, her own dinner untouched, her heart hammering against her ribs with a fury that made her dizzy. Yuna, Grace said. It's okay, Yuna said, her voice small and far away. He's right. It's not practical. I should focus on piano and dancing and things that are suitable. No, Grace said. The word came out louder than she intended. She stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. No, Yuna, he is not right. Yuna looked up, her eyes wide. Grace? Grace didn't answer. She walked out of the kitchen, through the living room, to the study where Junho was already opening his laptop. She stood in the doorway. She didn't knock. She didn't wait to be invited. Mr. Seo. He looked up, surprised. Grace, I said good night. What you just said to her, Grace said, and her voice was low and steady. I need you to understand what it does to a child when the person they love most tells them their mind has a ceiling. Junho's expression shifted. The surprise hardened into something defensive. Grace, this is not your place. I know, but someone has to say it. She stepped fully into the room. The study smelled of leather and old paper, and the particular loneliness of a man who had surrounded himself with expensive things and still couldn't sleep. Yuna is 7 years old, and she just told you what she wants to be, and you didn't hear her. You decided for her, based on nothing except that she's a girl. That's not guidance, Mr. Seo. That's a cage, and you're building it small enough that she won't even notice she's inside it until it's too late. Silence. The kind of silence that has weight and texture. Junho's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping in his cheek. I think you've forgotten your role in this house, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Maybe, but I haven't forgotten mine with her. Grace glanced toward the doorway, where she knew Yuna was standing, frozen, wide-eyed, watching Grace the way a child watches someone do something they've always wanted to do but were afraid to. Grace looked back at Junho. She was calm. She was steady. She had never been more certain of anything in her life. Don't talk to her like that again, she said. Junho stood up. He was taller than her, broader, a man who commanded rooms and ended arguments with a single look. But Grace didn't flinch. She held his gaze, and she saw the battle in his eyes. The anger, yes, but beneath it, something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. Pack your things, Junho said. You're done. Yes, Grace said. I know. She turned and walked out of the study. Yuna was standing in the hallway, her face pale, her hands clutching the hem of her sweater. Grace? She whispered. Grace knelt down. She took Yuna's hands in hers. They were cold. Listen to me, she said. I need you to remember something, and I need you to remember it forever. You can be an engineer. You can be anything that requires a brain and a will. You have both. Don't let anyone measure those for you. Not your father, not a teacher, not the world, no one. Yuna's lip trembled. Are you leaving? Yes, baby, I have to. Because of me? Because of me, Grace said, and she pulled Yuna into her arms, feeling the child's tears soak through her cardigan, hot and desperate. Because I couldn't stay and watch him put bars on your windows. Because I love you too much to be quiet. Yuna sobbed then, a sound that came from deep in her small body, raw and broken. Grace held her, rocking her, whispering things that weren't words, just sounds of comfort, just promises without language. She didn't know how long they stayed there on the hallway floor. She knew only that when she finally stood, her legs were numb and Yuna's face was swollen and the house had gone dark around them. She packed her things. It didn't take long. She had always traveled light. She changed out of her uniform and into her street clothes, the cardigan folded carefully in her bag. She went to Yuna's room one last time. The child was sitting on her bed, staring at the wall, the velvet case of screwdrivers clutched in her lap. "I left them for you," Grace said, sitting beside her. "On purpose. Because I saw you. I saw what you loved, and I wanted you to know it was worth loving." Yuna turned to her. Her eyes were dry now, shocked empty. "Will you come back?" "I don't know," Grace said, and the honesty of it cut her. "I hope so, but I can't promise." "Then promise you'll remember me." "Oh, Yuna," Grace pulled her close, breathing her in one last time. "I will remember you in every clock radio I see, in every capacitor, in every child who looks at something broken and believes it can be fixed. I will remember you in my bones." She stood up, she walked to the door, she looked back once, at the small figure on the bed, and then she walked down the stairs and out of the house and into the cold Saturday night, and she did not look back again, because she knew if she did, she would not be able to leave. The bus ride home was a blur. The city lights streaked past the windows like falling stars. Grace sat with her bag on her lap, her hands folded, her face wet with tears she hadn't realized she was crying. She thought about Yuna's face, the way it had gone blank at her father's words. She thought about the cage. She thought about the screwdriver set, small and perfect, waiting on a desk in a room she would never see again. She thought about Junho, standing in his study, his face crumpled, his hand raised to knock on a door he couldn't open. She thought about the photograph on the dresser, the beach, the real smile. She thought about all the men who had been told they could only be one thing, and how they passed that prison on to their children, generation after generation, without ever meaning to. By the time she reached her apartment, it was past 10. She climbed the stairs, each step heavier than the last. She unlocked her door and stood in the dark, looking at her small life. The second-hand sofa, the window that looked out on an alley, the photograph of her mother on the shelf. She had been here before. She had lost jobs before. She had survived. But she had never left a piece of her heart behind in a child's bedroom, and she didn't know how to survive that. She didn't sleep. She sat by the window and watched the city breathe, and she thought about what she had done. She didn't regret it. That was the strange thing. She didn't regret a single word. She only regretted that she hadn't said them sooner, that she had waited 8 months, that she had let Yuna sit at that table and hear her father's dismissal without a shield. At dawn, she rose and made tea. She sat at her small table and wrote a letter she knew she wouldn't send. "Dear Mr. CO," it began, "I am not sorry for what I said. I am only sorry that you needed to hear it from a stranger. Yuna is not a project to be managed. She is a person to be discovered. Please, before it's too late, please look at her." She signed it, folded it, put it in a drawer. She would never send it. Some truths needed to be spoken in person, or not at all. If you've ever had to walk away from something you loved because staying would have meant betraying yourself, I see you. I want you to know that courage doesn't always look like standing up. Sometimes it looks like leaving. Sometimes it looks like silence. If you understand that, hit the like button. Not for the algorithm, for the part of you that had to be brave when no one was watching. The first week without the Scene House was a kind of grief Grace hadn't expected. She woke at 5:30 out of habit, her body trained to rhythms that no longer existed. She lay in bed and listened to the silence of her apartment, and she imagined Yuna waking at 6:10, going downstairs, finding the kitchen empty of warm milk and knowing, with the wisdom of children, that Grace was gone. She looked for work, she went to agencies, she interviewed with families who had infants with colic, toddlers with tantrums, houses that smelled of diapers and desperation. She smiled and nodded and explained her experience, and she watched the mothers look at her resume and ask, "Why did you leave your last position?" She said it wasn't a good fit anymore. She didn't say, "I told a father he was breaking his daughter and he fired me for it." She didn't say, "I chose a child over a paycheck and I would do it again." No one hired her. The market was tight. References were checked. She knew Junho wouldn't give her a bad reference. He was too proud for that, too aware of his own reputation. But he wouldn't give her a good one either. He would say, she left suddenly, personal reasons. And that would be enough. That would be the shadow that followed her. She took temporary work, cleaning offices at night when the buildings were empty and the vacuum cleaners echoed in the halls like lonely animals. She scrubbed toilets in restaurants after closing, her hands red and raw. She didn't mind the work. She had never minded hard work. But she minded the absence. She minded the way her chest ached at 5:30 every morning, the way she found herself setting the table for 3 before remembering there was only 1, the way she reached for a child's hand that wasn't there when she crossed the street. She thought about calling. She picked up her phone 100 times and put it down. What would she say? I'm sorry? She wasn't sorry. I miss you? That would only make it harder. How is she? She knew how Yuna was. She was quiet. She was careful. She was putting her screwdrivers in her school bag and carrying them everywhere because they were the only thing that felt like hope. At the Seo house, things were falling apart in small ways that no one noticed except the ones who lived there. The first nanny lasted 3 days. She was young, efficient, and she made Yuna's milk too hot. Yuna didn't complain. She just didn't drink it. She sat at the table and stared at the cup until it went cold, and then she poured it down the sink when no one was looking. The nanny thought she was obedient. She didn't know the child was grieving. The second nanny lasted 4 days. She was older, strict, and she took away Yuna's screwdrivers because she found them inappropriate for a young lady. Yuna didn't cry. She went to her room and sat on her bed and didn't come down for dinner. Junho came home at midnight and found her there, still in her school uniform, her eyes open and unseeing. He stood in the doorway and felt a fear he didn't have a name for. The third nanny lasted 2 days. She was kind but overwhelmed, and she kept trying to hug Yuna, who flinched from touch now, who had learned that affection was something that could be taken away. She quit on the second morning, leaving a note on the kitchen counter that said simply, "This child needs something I cannot give." Junho didn't hire a fourth. He took the week off work, a thing he had not done in 15 years, and stayed home. He sat in the living room and watched Yuna. She moved through the house like a ghost, like water, like someone who had learned to be invisible. She didn't play piano. She didn't read. She sat on the floor of her room with the broken clock radio in her lap, turning it over and over, running her fingers along the cracks in the plastic. Yuna, Junho said on the third day. He was sitting on the edge of her bed, his hands clasped between his knees, his posture that of a man who had never learned to ask for forgiveness. "Do you want to talk about it?" Yuna looked at him. Her eyes were not angry. They were worse than angry. They were empty. About what, Appa? About Grace. About why she left. "She didn't leave," Yuna said. "You made her go." Junho flinched. That's not entirely fair, Yuna. Isn't it? Yuna turned the clock radio over in her hands. "You told her to pack her things. I heard you. I was in the hallway. I was angry. She said things that were out of line. She said I could be an engineer," Yuna said. "She said I could be anything. And you said that was wrong. So she stood up for me. And you punished her for it." Yuna's voice was flat, factual, the voice of a child who had watched the world closely and learned its rules. "That means you made her go, doesn't it?" Junho opened his mouth, closed it. He looked at his daughter, this small person with her broken clock and her sharp mind, and he felt the first true crack in the foundation of everything he had believed about himself. "I thought I was protecting you," he said, and the words came out rough, unused. "From what?" Yuna asked. "From screwdrivers? From capacitors? From someone who believed me? From disappointment, from a world that won't be kind to you if you choose a hard path." Yuna was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Appa, do you know what disappointment feels like?" It feels like warm milk that's gone cold. It feels like screwdrivers in a school bag because you can't leave them at home or they'll be taken away. It feels like being told you're a girl, so your dreams are too big for you." She looked down at the clock. "I think I know more about disappointment than you do, because you taught me." Junho felt his eyes burn. He reached out tentatively and touched Yuna's hair. She didn't pull away. That was worse than if she had. She simply didn't react, as if his touch were rain, as if it were nothing. "Yuna," he whispered. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." "For what?" For not seeing you, for not hearing you, for being afraid." Yuna looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen in weeks. Not forgiveness, not yet, but possibility. A door opening, just a crack. "Grace saw me," Yuna said. "From the first day, she saw me." "I know," Junho said. "I know she did." "Then bring her back." "I can't," Junho said. "I fired her. I was cruel. She won't come back." "She will," Yuna said, with a certainty that made Junho's heart ache. "If you ask her, if you mean it, if you tell her you're sorry." "Yuna." "Call her," Yuna said. "Please, Appa, call her." Junho sat on his daughter's bed for a long time. The afternoon light turned gold and then gray. He thought about Grace's face in the study, steady and unafraid. He thought about her words. "That's a cage. And you're building it small enough that she won't even notice she's inside it until it's too late." He thought about his own father, telling him that a man's worth was in what he built. He thought about the beach photograph, the real smile, the arm around his daughter. He thought about all the years he had spent building a life that looked perfect from the outside and was hollow at the center. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He scrolled to Grace's number. His thumb hovered over the call button. He thought about pride. He thought about the cost of being right versus the cost of being alone. He thought about his daughter, watching him with eyes that were learning whether it was safe to hope. He didn't press call. He couldn't. Not yet. But he didn't put the phone away either. He sat there, holding it, while Yuna turned her clock radio over and over in her small hands, and the house settled into evening around them, and somewhere across the city, Grace sat by her window and felt the ache of absence like a second heartbeat. The second week was harder than the first. Grace's savings were dwindling. She took more night shifts, cleaning office buildings in the business district, her reflection ghosting in the dark glass of skyscrapers. She wore headphones and listened to podcasts about science, about engineering, about women who had built bridges and designed circuits and refused to be told no. She thought about Yuna with every story. She wondered if the child was still fixing things, still dreaming, still carrying her screwdrivers like talismans. She got a letter, not from Junho, from Yuna. The handwriting was careful, the letters large and slightly uneven, the paper scented with the lavender soap that Grace had bought for the CO house. "Dear Grace, I am writing this in my room. Appa doesn't know. I told him I was doing homework. I am not doing homework. I am writing to you. School is okay. Teacher says my science project is very good. I wrote engineer in my dream journal. In big letters. The biggest. I carry the screwdrivers everywhere. Appa hasn't said anything. He looks at me sometimes like he wants to say something, but he doesn't know the words. I think he is learning. I miss you. I miss you so much that sometimes I forget to breathe and then I remember and it hurts. Please come back, if you can, if you want to, if he asks you. I love you. Yuna." Grace read the letter until the ink blurred. She held it to her chest and sat in her dark apartment and cried for the first time since she left. Not the controlled tears of the strong, but the wild, ugly sobs of someone who had been holding herself together with thread and willpower. She cried for Yuna. She cried for herself. She cried for Junho, who was trying, in his clumsy way, to become something better. She cried for all the children who had been told their dreams were too big, and all the adults who had done the telling, and all the Graces of the world who couldn't save everyone but had to try anyway. She didn't write back. She didn't know what to say. She couldn't promise to return. She couldn't bear to say no. She folded the letter and put it in her cardigan pocket, over her heart, and she carried it with her through the nights of cleaning, through the empty days, through the long hours of waiting. At the CO house, Junho was changing in ways that didn't show on the surface but ran deep as roots. He came home earlier, he sat in the living room and watched Yuna do her homework. He didn't understand the math, variables and equations that hadn't existed when he was in school, but he sat there, his laptop closed, his presence a kind of penance. He brought home books from the store, illustrated guides to electricity, biographies of female scientists, a beginner's soldering kit. He left them on Yuna's desk without comment, the way Grace had left the screwdrivers. Yuna looked at the books. She touched the soldering kit. She didn't say thank you. She wasn't ready. But she didn't throw them away either. She placed them on her shelf, beside the clock radio that was still waiting for its capacitor, and she let them sit there, accumulating meaning. On the Wednesday of the third week, Junho came home with a small paper bag. He found Yuna in the living room, the clock radio in her lap, her screwdrivers laid out on the towel. "Yuna, he said. He sat on the floor beside her. It was awkward, his knees too long, his suit too expensive for the carpet, but he sat. "I have something." Yuna looked at him, wary, careful. He opened the bag and took out a capacitor. Small, cylindrical, the exact specifications Yuna had written in her notebook. She stared at it, her mouth opened slightly. "How did you—" "I called the manufacturer. I described the model. I told them my daughter needed it." He held it out, his hand trembling slightly. "I thought maybe we could install it together. If you want, if you'd show me." Yuna looked at the capacitor. She looked at her father, sitting on the floor in his $1,000 suit, his hair falling over his forehead, his eyes naked with hope and fear. She looked at the clock radio, broken and waiting. "I don't know how," she said. "Not all of it. I need help." "Then we'll figure it out," Junho said. "Together, if you want." Yuna was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached out and took the capacitor. She didn't smile, but she didn't turn away either. "Okay," she said, "but you have to listen. When I tell you about the circuit, you have to really listen." "I will," Junho said, and his voice broke. "I promise, Yuna, I will listen." They worked on the clock that evening. Yuna explained the circuit, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, her hands steady. Junho listened, really listened, his head bent close to hers, asking questions that were clumsy but genuine. They soldered the new capacitor into place. They closed the back panel. They plugged it in. The clock radio hummed to life. The display flickered, steadied, glowed a soft green. The radio crackled, found a station, filled the room with music, something classical, piano, gentle and ascending. Yuna stared at it, her face crumpled. She began to cry, not the silent tears she had learned, but deep, heaving sobs that shook her small frame. Junho pulled her into his arms, awkward, desperate, and held her while she cried. And he cried too, his tears falling into her hair, both of them broken and mended in the same moment. "I miss Grace," Yuna sobbed. "I miss her so much." "I know," Junho whispered. "I know, my love. I miss her too." They sat on the floor, holding each other, the clock radio playing its soft music, and Junho knew what he had to do. He knew it with a certainty that felt like grace itself. "If you're still here, if you've stayed with me through the hard parts, thank you. I need you to do something. I need you to think about the person you need to call, the apology you need to make, the door you need to open. Don't wait for 3 weeks. Don't wait for the clock to break. Do it now. And if you're not ready to do it yet, that's okay too. Just hit subscribe and let this story sit with you until you are. We're almost at the end, but the end is where the real work begins." Grace was sitting by her window when the phone rang. It was Wednesday evening, the sky the color of bruised plums, the city lights beginning to assert themselves against the dark. She didn't recognize the number at first. She almost didn't answer. She was tired, her hands sore from cleaning fluid, her heart heavy with the letter in her pocket. She picked up. "Hello?" Silence. Then, a small voice. 7 years old and carrying something much heavier than herself. "Grace?" Grace closed her eyes. She felt the world tilt and steady. "Yuna?" A pause, the sound of breathing, careful and controlled. "Daddy said, he said to call you. He said to say we miss you." Another pause. "But I think he misses you for himself too, not just for the house." Grace pressed her hand to her chest, to the letter in her pocket. "How are you, baby?" "I told my teacher I want to be an engineer. She said I should write it in my dream journal." "Did you write it?" "In big letters, the biggest." Yuna's voice wavered. "And Appa bought me a capacitor. For the clock. We fixed it together. He soldered and everything. He burned his finger and said a bad word, and then he laughed." Grace felt a smile break across her face, painful and sweet. He laughed? Yes, and he bought me books. About scientists. Women scientists. He leaves them on my desk. He doesn't say anything, but he leaves them. That's good, Yuna. That's very good. I want you to come back, Yuna said. And now her voice was small again, fragile. The voice of a child who had learned that wanting things could hurt. But only if you want to. Only if Appa says the right things. I don't want you to come back if he's still building the cage. Grace felt tears on her face. Yuna, how did you get so wise? I had a good teacher, Yuna said. She taught me that being brave is more important than being quiet. Even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Grace? A new voice on the line. Deeper, rougher. Junho. Grace stiffened. She didn't speak. Grace, Yuna wanted to call. But I need to say something too. He stopped. She heard him breathing. The struggle of a man who had never learned to apologize. I was wrong. About everything. About you. About her. About what she needs. I thought I was protecting her from the world, but I was only protecting myself from my own fear. And I fired you because you saw me. You saw me clearly, and I couldn't bear it. Grace stood up. She walked to the window, pressing her forehead against the cool glass. You needed to bear it, she said quietly. For her, you need to bear being seen. I know, Junho said. I'm trying. I'm learning. The clock, it was the first thing I've built with her. The first thing I've really seen her do. And I realized I've been building walls around her when I should have been building bridges. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to come back, not as an employee, not as staff, as whatever you were to her, to us, a witness, a teacher. He stopped. I don't have a word for it. I just know that the house is wrong without you. That Yuna is better but not whole. That I am trying but I don't know how to finish. Grace was quiet. She watched a couple walking below, holding hands, their breath visible in the cold air. She thought about her apartment, her empty rooms, her night shifts. She thought about the letter in her pocket, the weight of Yuna's trust. She thought about the man on the other end of the line, powerful and broken, learning to kneel. I'll come back, she said, but not to work. Not for a salary, for her. And for you, if you're serious. But I need something first. Anything. A conversation, face to face. No phones, no Yuna, just you and me, and the truth. When? Tomorrow, Saturday, morning. I'll be there, Junho said. Grace, thank you for answering, for listening, for being brave when I couldn't be. Grace hung up. She stood in the dark of her apartment, the phone still in her hand, and she felt the first true warmth she had felt in 3 weeks. Not hope, exactly. Something more durable, something like the beginning of a bridge. She didn't sleep. She packed a small bag. She laid out her clothes, the cream blouse, the charcoal slacks, the oatmeal cardigan. She washed her face. She looked in the mirror and saw a woman who had been through fire and had not burned. She saw someone who was ready to go back, not because the battle was won, but because the war was worth fighting. Saturday morning dawned clear and cold. Grace took the bus, watching the city wake, feeling the familiar route in her bones. She got off at the usual stop. She walked to the gate. She punched in the code, 4289, Yuna's birthday, and let herself in. The house looked different. She couldn't say how. It was the same glass and marble, the same polished perfection, but something had shifted. The air smelled different, less of absence, more of possibility. Junho opened the door before she could knock. He was dressed casually, a sweater, jeans, clothes she had never seen him in. He looked younger. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had been humbled and was still deciding whether to let the humbling change him. Grace, he said, Mr. CO, please, come in. She entered. The house was warm. There were flowers on the console table, yellow chrysanthemums, bright and defiant against the gray morning. Grace took off her shoes and placed them in the cabinet. Yuna's pink sneakers were there, scuffed now, well worn. Beside them, a pair of small work boots, new, for fixing things. Where is she? Grace asked. Upstairs, reading. She doesn't know you're here yet. I wanted to talk first. They went to the dining room. Not the study, Grace noticed. Not his territory. Neutral ground. They sat across from each other at the long table, the morning light streaming through the windows, turning the dust motes into gold. Junho folded his hands. He looked at her directly, and Grace saw the change. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a tearful apology or a grand declaration. It was simply a man who had been seen clearly and found lacking, and had decided, quietly, that he didn't want to stay that way. "I'll come back," Grace said, before he could speak. "For Yuna. Not for the house, not for the salary, for her." Junho nodded. "I understand. But I need one thing from you. Not a list, just one thing. Name it." Grace leaned forward. She held his gaze, steady and unblinking. "You do not tell that little girl what she cannot be because she is a girl. Not once, not in front of me, not behind my back, not as a joke, not as practicality, not ever." She let the words settle, she let them grow roots. "If you do, I walk. And this time I won't be coming back. I won't answer the phone, I won't write letters. I will be a ghost in her memory, and you will have to live with knowing that you chose your fear over her future. Do you understand?" He looked at his hands, hands that had signed million-dollar contracts, that had built towers, that had recently held a soldering iron and burned themselves in the service of something small and precious. He looked at Grace, this woman who had cleaned his floors, and then stood up to him with a courage he had never possessed. He nodded. "I understand." "Say it," Grace said. "Say you understand." "I understand," Junho said, and his voice was clear, unwavering. "I will not limit her. I will not measure her. I will not tell her what she cannot be. I will only try to see what she is, and help her become it." Grace sat back. She felt the tension drain from her shoulders, leaving her light, almost floating. "Good," she said. "Then I'll stay." Junho closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. He didn't hide it. "Thank you," he said, "for giving me another chance. I don't deserve it." "No," Grace said, but gently. "You don't. Not yet. But you're learning. That's enough for now." They sat in silence for a moment. Two people who had been enemies and were becoming something else. Not friends, exactly. Allies, perhaps. Co-conspirators in the project of raising a child who would not be caged. "Can I see her now?" Grace asked. Junho smiled. It was a real smile, small and hesitant, but genuine. "I'll get her." "No," Grace said. "Let me go. Let me find her." She climbed the stairs. She walked the hallway. She stopped outside Yuna's door, which was closed, as it always was when the child was concentrating. She knocked softly. "Come in," Yuna called. Grace opened the door. Yuna was sitting at her desk, her back to the door, bent over something. The room was different. The walls, once bare, were covered with drawings. Circuit diagrams, pictures of rockets, a poster of a woman in a lab coat with Korean text beneath her. The future is built by those who refuse to accept limits. Grace's breath caught. She stepped inside. Yuna turned. She saw Grace. Her face went blank with shock, then flooded with light. A joy so bright it was almost painful to witness. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She stood up slowly, as if afraid Grace might vanish if she moved too fast. "Grace?" she whispered. "Hello, baby," Grace said, and her voice was thick with tears. "You came back. I came back. For good? For good." Yuna crossed the room in 3 steps and threw herself into Grace's arms. Grace caught her, lifted her, held her close, feeling the child's heart hammer against her own, feeling the small arms tight around her neck, feeling the wetness of tears on her collarbone. "I knew you would," Yuna sobbed. "I knew it." "You did?" "Yes, because you're Grace. You always come back for the broken things." Grace laughed, the sound breaking through her tears. "Yes," she said. "I suppose I do." They held each other for a long time. Grace looked over Yuna's shoulder at the room, the books on the shelf, the soldering kit on the desk, the clock radio on the nightstand, its display glowing soft green. She saw the work boots by the door. She saw the life that was being built here, piece by piece, by a father learning to see and a daughter learning to dream out loud. Downstairs, Junho stood in the kitchen, listening to the sounds from above. He didn't go up. He knew this moment wasn't his. He made tea instead, 3 cups, and he waited. The days that followed were not perfect. Nothing ever is. Junho still worked too much. He still forgot to listen sometimes, still made mistakes, still reached for his phone at dinner before catching himself and putting it away. Yuna still flinched occasionally when he raised his voice, still had nights when she woke from dreams she wouldn't describe, still carried her screwdrivers in her bag because old fears die slowly. Grace still woke at 5:30, still moved through the house with quiet purpose, still noticed everything. But the house began to change. The silence shifted from wounded to healing. Laughter appeared in rooms where it had never been. Junho started coming home for dinner on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and on Saturdays he didn't go to the office at all. He sat on the floor with Yuna and let her teach him about resistors and diodes. He burned his fingers more than once. He said bad words and then laughed. And Yuna laughed too, her head thrown back, her mouth open, the sound like bells. Grace watched them. She didn't join them. Not always. She learned to step back, to let the space between father and daughter grow and breathe, to be present without being necessary. She cooked meals that were eaten at the table instead of in front of screens. She left books on Yuna's desk and tools in the storage closet, and she watched the child discover her own competence, her own strength, her own voice. And then came the Saturday morning that Grace would remember for the rest of her life. She was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast, humming something tuneless. The sun was bright, pouring through the windows, turning everything gold. She heard footsteps on the stairs, not the heavy tread of Junho, but the lighter, quicker steps of Yuna. Then silence. Then more footsteps, heavier, slower. Junho. She heard them in the living room. She stopped humming, her hands still in the soapy water, listening. Yuna was on the floor, cross-legged, tongue between her teeth, carefully unscrewing the back panel of a new project. A small radio-controlled car that Junho had bought her, broken on purpose, a challenge. She was fully absorbed. She looked like a tiny engineer, her brow furrowed, her hands steady, her tools laid out in a neat row on the towel. Junho walked in, stopped at the doorway, watched. Grace held her breath. She remembered this scene. She remembered another Saturday, another living room, another clock radio. She remembered the way he had reached down and taken it without a word. She remembered the cage. Junho stood at the doorway for a long moment. Then, slowly, carefully, as if approaching something sacred, he walked across the room. He didn't reach down. He didn't take the car away. He sat on the floor beside his daughter, his long legs folding awkwardly, his sweater riding up, his expensive trousers creasing on the carpet. Yuna looked up, surprised. "Appa? Show me what you're doing," Junho said. His voice was soft, curious, the voice of a student. Yuna stared at him. Then, slowly, a smile spread across her face. Not the careful, hesitant smile she had worn for so long. A real smile, wide and bright and unguarded. She held up the car. "See, the motor is disconnected from the receiver. I think the solder joint broke. I need to reflow it. But I have to be careful because the wires are really small." "Show me," Junho said. "Teach me." Yuna showed him. She explained the circuit, her voice gaining confidence, her hands moving with authority. Junho listened, his head bent close to hers, his eyes following her fingers. He asked questions. He made mistakes. He let her correct him. He let her be the expert, the teacher, the one who knew. Grace watched from the kitchen doorway, her hands still wet with soap, her heart so full it felt like it might overflow. She didn't go in. This moment was not hers. It belonged to Yuna and Junho, to the slow, difficult, beautiful work of rebuilding what had been broken. She turned back to the kitchen. She dried her hands. She looked out the window at the morning, at the city, at the world that was still hard and often cruel, but occasionally, miraculously, capable of change. And that's where we end. Not with a wedding, not with a miracle cure, not with everything fixed forever, but with a father on the floor, learning to see, with a child who has not stopped being careful, but has learned to be brave as well, with a woman in a kitchen, turning back to her work, knowing that she has done what she came to do. If this story reached you, if it made you think of someone you love, someone you're trying to see more clearly, I want you to do one thing. Call them. or text them. Or just sit with them tonight and ask them what they dream about. Don't correct them, don't guide them, just listen, really listen. And if you don't have someone like that, if you're still waiting for your grace or trying to become her, drop a comment below. Tell me what you're building. Tell me what you're fixing. Tell me what you're hoping for. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that stories can change us, that seeing each other is the hardest and most important work we do, that it's never too late to sit on the floor and ask to be taught. Hit the like button if this story mattered to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and I'll see you in the next story. Until then, be brave, be patient, and don't let anyone measure your dreams for you. Not ever.